Nasir Khusraw is a major Muslim intellectual from the 11th century. He's famous both for his philosophical works, for his corpus of poetry, and for his prose record of his travels that he took, and this is called the Safarnameh. He's also famous for having a very strong personality that was very effective in spreading the word of the Ismaili Shiite faith, which he chose in midlife. And he comes from the eastern Persian-speaking lands of Qobadian in the province of Marv, near Balkh, and these lands are now eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan. But before then, in his time, they did not have these boundaries, of course. And so he's come through the 1,000 years with a strong record and a strong personality that people can really relate to. Nasir Khusraw had a dream, and in the dream a voice came to him and said, "How long are you going to keep living this life with drinking?" And he said, "The world has given nothing finer to take away the sorrows of the world." And he said, a man who is addled by alcohol is not going to be able to be called a hakim and lead other people to knowledge. And he then pointed in the direction of Mecca, and he disappeared. Nasir Khusraw says he woke up and he remembered the dream very vividly and realized that he had to change his life, and that from then on he would become a different person. And as soon as they finished the tour, collecting the taxes, he went home, he put his affairs in order, and he set out on a journey toward the west with his brother and a servant. And the Safarnameh is a record of this journey. It took 7 years, and the route he traveled was from Marv and over northern Iran to Armenia, Azerbaijan, over to Syria, down to Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, he went to visit all the shrines and then took a quick trip on the Hajj. But he tells us, I'm not going to tell you about what a Hajj is until a later time, which tells us what? It tells us that he wrote this later. He was taking notes. This is not a day-by-day diary, but that he's shaping it later. And so then he goes back to Jerusalem, goes to Cairo, lives in Cairo for 3 years, and at that time Cairo was the capital of the Fatimid Empire, which was an Ismaili Shiite empire. And it was the seat of learning, seat of knowledge, and seat of political power and military power of a great empire which stretched across northern Africa, controlled Sicily, the Levant, had direct connections, many relations with the Byzantines, as well as, of course, the Sunni Caliphate in Baghdad. The Fatimid Caliphate was also in charge of the Hijaz and taking care of the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And who's ever in charge of Mecca and Medina has to take care of the pilgrims, has to, for the annual Hajj, or the pilgrims throughout the year. And Nasir Khusraw became part of this. And at his fourth Hajj, he took his leave and to go back home. And he went across the Arabian desert and up to the port of Basra in Iraq, and then across Iran and up to Central Asia and back home. And along the way, he tells us little wonderful details of things that he sees along the way. And the Safarnameh is written in an accessible, easy, serene, simple Persian. And it's taught in schools in Iran, wherever anyone's learning Persian, as a beautiful example of early Persian and Persian prose, where it is not encumbered by trying to do fancy turns of phrase or poetic acrobatics in the language. And so it's a wonderful, real, personal account of his travels. It was not commissioned by a court. It's not written for the king. It's a very personal account of his stories, of the things that he saw and the questions that he asked and the people he saw. From Nasir Khusraw's Safarnameh, we can learn a lot about the 11th century. First of all, the great expanse of geography, but also of imagination, and that people could imagine traveling thousands of miles to make one trip. A possible comparison is in the United States, that it's not a big deal to travel across the states. We just see them as states, and it's not a big deal. But even to go to Canada is across the border, or to go to Mexico is across the border. And so in the 11th century Middle East, we didn't have these borders, and so the mind could go that these were all home. That someone from Pakistan could go to Spain and be just equally accepted, or someone from Morocco could go to India or northern Uzbekistan and be equally accepted and know how to be in a mosque and be part of the Muslim world. And so that's one thing. What we also see are great empires of military might in relation to each other. So in his time in Cairo, he's very aware of the Byzantines. For example, there's an island in the delta, the Nile Delta, that was just for making fabric. And there's wonderful, gorgeous fabric called buqalamun, which today is a word in Persian, just means turkey, meaning the animal, the bird. But what is buqalamun? It is an iridescent fabric with different color threads woven throughout it, so that as it moves, it glistens in different ways, and you see different colors. And in one poem, he says, we must be like buqalamun. We must be able to shine in different ways and to see the different sights. But this island of Tinnis was so powerful because it had this creation, this craft, and everyone worked there. And fabric was a major product of the Fatimids. It was exported, or it would be given as a mantle of honor to someone. Today we don't think of fabric much as a luxury item, but of course it has to be woven, the products have to be made, and you have to put it in a beautiful art form. So besides the fabric, there's also the embroidery on it. So the story is that the Byzantine emperor wanted this island, and he sent his emissaries to negotiate with the Fatimid emperor, the caliph in Cairo, to see if he could buy it. He said, I'll give you 100 islands. I'll give you anything you could in exchange for this island. And the Fatimids would never give it up. And he says there's another tale that emissaries came from Iran, from a court in southern Iran, and they waited months and months and months to try to even get some fabric, and they went away empty-handed. So this luxury item of fabric is an important part of the culture, and Nasir Khusraw gives details. He says, for example, wool, back in Khorasan, in eastern Iran, we call something Egyptian wool. But actually, when you're in Egypt, it's not made in Egypt. It's made in what's called Upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt, the more mountainous area, southern Egypt, which would be the Sudan area. And so his travels open him up to that we in one place might think one thing or call something one thing, but in another place it's quite different. And I think this openness of the mind to looking at other cultures, to seeing what's possible, the navy is a very important, all the different kinds of ships that are traveling in and out, and how problems are solved. Nasir Khusraw asks wherever he goes, like, what's going on? Why do you build roads this way? When he's in northern Iran, he says he sees that they put logs down and on the road, and this is so that there wouldn't be so much mud, and so in winter it wouldn't be so slippery. He looks at differences. They're looking at differences both of what God has done, natural creations of things that have happened, but also of what humans have done, what humans have made in art and human customs also. And for example, he says in Armenia that you could see women sitting in the cafes, sitting in restaurants, which amazes him. But also he's in one mosque and he sits back and he writes, they had a vase there. There was a marble vase. And it was so strong, but it was so thin that you could see through it. It was translucent, and yet it could hold hundreds of pounds of water. And so this amazement of what humans could create constantly comes to him. And also the customs. He's very careful to say, so they say, or I heard. Or he says, I heard, for example, there was a place in Syria where if you go over there, you lean over the edge of and listen in the valley, you can hear the people in hell screaming. And he writes, I went there, but I didn't hear anything. And so he's testing. When he gets to Basra, he hears this story that he tells that one day a whirlpool occurred in the port of Basra. And now you can't have a whirlpool of the currents turning around in the middle of a port that needs to have boats coming in and out for merchants. And so everybody's saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? The city's shut down if there's a whirlpool. And so finally there was a lady, merchant, who had stacks and stacks, like silos filled of date nuts, like the nuts that were the seeds of dates. And she said, what we'll do, we'll fill up several boats and with these date seeds, and we'll sink the boats so that it will get to the bottom of the whirlpool and intercept the currents. And that this was done, and that it solved the problem. What does this tell us? This tells us how problems were made. It tells us there were silos of date seeds around for some purpose, and that it tells us that women were part of the economy, part of the problem-solving conversation, and not nowhere in the society. And so, and it tells us a little bit about the ways of travel. And sometimes he's with a caravan, sometimes he seems to be traveling alone, but we can't tell. With his brother, and he in fact interjects some humor into his work in some places. For example, one of the early stops they make is a town called Kharzavil in northern Iran. And he says, he sends his brother in to get some supplies in the local store. And he says, when they asked for something, whatever they asked for, the shopkeeper would say, no, we don't have any. And he said, let's say they asked for bread. He said, no, I don't have any bread. He says, do you have any honey? He said, no, I don't have honey. And it seemed as if that he had nothing. And so Nasir Khusraw says, what kind of a store is that where the guy has nothing to sell? And he said, so from ever after, on the journey, whenever he and his brother would get to a shop, they would joke and say, I wonder if this is going to be like the shopkeeper in Kharzavil that doesn't have anything. And then at the end of his journey, there's another sign of humor. And that's when they're approaching home, and the arrival a caravan is a great bit of news. A caravan is coming. A caravan is coming, and so he finds out that the caravan would send out messengers up ahead to see who's up ahead, and then it found out that there's an army camp, and the army camp of one of the Seljuk princes or lords, and that his other brother was in that camp. And so a messenger came from that camp saying, asking, in this caravan, could there be a Nasir Khusraw, where my brother went away 7 years ago? And Nasir Khusraw says, tells the messenger, yes, it could be. It could be. We could write. We could. And the messenger says, because my brother would really, my lord, the Nasir Khusraw's brother would really like a letter from Nasir Khusraw to have some news from him. And he says, well, why don't you find out? Maybe your lord would rather have the real Nasir Khusraw come and instead of a letter. And so that's the way he arrives home, and in enjoying that he's going to be well received, and that's the end of the Safarnameh, where he says, I hope to one day make a trip to the farther east countries and write about that also. And unfortunately we don't have that, and that never happened. So we have the journey that we do have. Well, Nasir wrote in Persian, so he's writing for a Persian audience. He doesn't seem to be writing for a special king. He doesn't dedicate it, as far as we know, to anyone. And he's writing it for the people back in Khorasan. And the way we know this are the certain clues that he puts in the text. For example, the one about the Nile River being wider than the Oxus near Termiz. But also he says in Cairo they have every kind of food that we ever saw in Khorasan, but only much more. And in Mecca, he says, on the Kaaba are 2 silver rings, far up high so that no one can reach them, that come from Ghazni. Down lower, there are rings that can be used to open the door, but they come from somewhere else. And so he's writing also to express that you wouldn't believe it. He says, there was so much wealth in Cairo that if I were to tell it to the people of Persia, no one would believe it. And so this is the audience that has read it through the 1,000 years and loved it very much. The travel and long-distance travel was very common in the Islamic world. For one thing, they didn't have the borders that we have today. So stretching from Spain to northern Africa, Sicily, to Turkey, throughout the Middle East, through Persia, into Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, into India, that this was all one land. And so it was all home to Muslims. And you also had the wonderful hadith of the Prophet who said to travel even unto China for knowledge, as well as, of course, the command that if you can, in your lifetime, make the Hajj to Mecca. And so people would often set out on the journey to Mecca, and it would take 20 years to get home. And they would go and see as much as they could along the way. But it was a religious virtue to go and travel for any kinds of knowledge, and to visit shrines, and to visit holy places, and to visit holy people, and to visit intellectuals, and to learn as much as you could. Before Nasir Khusraw, the connections were already there. Chinese boats were already in the port of Basra in the 800s, and Muslim boats were already in China. So the travel between east and farther east was already happening. We have early writers such as Al-Muqaddasi, who is from Jerusalem, Al-Quds, who took an early Hajj when he was about 20 and then decided, this is great, I'm going to keep traveling. And his book has been written and studied. Other early travelers include Abul Fida, who went from Baghdad, went up north to the Volga and into Scandinavia, and is one of our best records of the Vikings that we have. And Al-Mas'udi's Muruj Zahab, the Fields of Gold, which just shows you how they describe the looking at the world as fields of gold, is considered a great example of Arabic literature and geography. And there's Muhammad ibn Halkal, who traveled for 30 years. And we can compare, for example, what he's writing about is he writes that in Cairo, it has more water than the Tigris and the Euphrates put together. But in Nasir Khusraw's account, since he's writing in Persian for an Eastern audience, he says the Nile, when it floods, is larger than the Oxus at Tirmiz. And so what we see, Nasir Khusraw is writing for a particular audience, for the Persian-speaking lands, and he puts details of the East in so that he can compare it with them. Other travelers came from many different places. From Africa, we have Al-Idrisi from Morocco, who made one of the first maps and was very much used to show the continents and that we have of Africa. And we have Mansu Musa, who is actually a king, an emperor with his base in Mali, and he traveled with his great caravan to make the Hajj, but he is a king. He's not a normal person. He traveled with this gigantic caravan, and the records say there were 80 camels just carrying gold, 300 pounds of gold on each camel, and that when he got to Cairo and he's spending the money, the gold markets had such problems with what he was spending and what it did to the prices that it took decades to make up for what this king, Mansu Musa, had done. But what he had also done is put Timbuktu on the map in a larger way, and so that set the stage for many more scholars going to Timbuktu, using Timbuktu as a center for education and great libraries and great learning. And of course, Ibn Battuta traveling around for decades and coming back home. And so when you say goodbye to your mother and father, hi, goodbye, I'm going on the Hajj, and you come back 30 years later, and they made diaries along the way and put these together, and they've been published. The difference in most of the other writers is that they wrote in Arabic, which was the language of science and intellectual learning, and the lingua franca of the whole Islamic empire, the way Latin was for Europe. So for Nasir Khusraw to write his record of travels in Persian is a statement of where he expects it to go. And so many times when you see lists of travelers now, if you look for Muslim travelers, his name doesn't come up because people are just looking at the Arabic sources. It has been translated into English by Wheeler Thaxton, and it's a very approachable text. The first lesson would be really the first lesson that Nasir shows us in the Safarnameh, and that is to be open to our own faults, to accept that we've done less than we wanted, that we've done things we didn't want to do, and then that we can change our lives and that we can make ourselves better, we can go on from there. And in the same sense, to know our priorities. Like, what are our priorities? Are you focusing on this world, or are you focusing on the next world? Are you focusing on your own physical benefit, or are you focusing on spiritual benefits, intellectual benefits? And there's also a great creativity to try different things. What should we do when we're in trouble? He tells the story, for example, in Basra, the story of the baths of Basra. He's come across the desert of Arabia. Suddenly he has no money. He and his brother look so bedraggled. They look like terrible, filthy beggars. And the first thing you have to do is get to a bath. So he goes to the public baths, but he can't even get in there. The children throw stones at him. The bath keeper throws him out and says, "Get out of here, you dirty, filthy ragamuffin," and you can't come in. Now this is this great scholar who's been in the courts. He knows the Ghaznavid courts, he knows the Seljuk courts, he knows the Fatimid courts. He's been welcomed in the highest levels with the finest fabrics. And here he can't even get into a bath to get clean. Because, of course, what he wants to do is present himself to the ruler of the town. But you can't go to the ruler of the town looking like a beggar. And he says, what am I going to do? He says he went back, leans against the wall, and says, wow, look at the world. Look what's happened here. What is he going to do? He's going to pull on his strengths. And this is what he's telling us to do. What are his strengths? He can write, and he's a scholar, and he's going to show this. So he writes a beautiful letter which demonstrates how erudite he is, how poetic he is, how knowledgeable he is. And through this letter, he introduces himself and somehow puts in a phrase that he's not quite, he would love to come see the prince. And then he sends a messenger to the prince with this letter. And a message comes back, oh my goodness, we're so honored to have such a person in this town. Please come, I'd like to give you an audience in the court. And he's able to send back a letter that says, we're not quite ready, which the ruler understands and sends money. And with the money, he's able to get clean and spend a month or so, 2 months in the court and pass a wonderful time in great company with great intellectuals and conversations. But he hadn't gone back to that first bath. So when he's ready to leave, in all his beautiful finery now, looking like a man of court, he decides to pay one last visit and go as a different person, dressed as a rich person, to the bath. And of course, he's welcomed with great honors, and the bath keeper cannot bow low enough to say, please come in, Your Highness, it's just wonderful to have you here. And they're speaking Arabic, and then Nasir Khusraw lets it be known that he can speak Arabic too, and that he knows, and suddenly the keeper of the baths realizes his error and what he had done and is very sorry for it. And Nasir Khusraw was able to make this lesson. And what is the lesson? Sometimes we find ourselves where we don't want to be. Sometimes our life turns upside down for reasons some under our control and sometimes not. But we have to call on ourselves, on our best selves, on our inner self. And these are elements that God has given us, that our intellect, our ability to think, our ability to solve problems, and to correct terrible situations, and not to just flail about and say, oh my goodness, it's over. And it's also a sad story in a way that many things in this world are based on what we look like physically. And so he knows, and certainly his lessons for us are that it's what's inside that counts, our soul, our intellect, our creative ability, and that to put these toward our highest priorities and put these toward our lives. And so these are some of the lessons that come out of the Safarnameh and are more deeply explored in his poetry and his prose philosophical works.